On December 6, 2009, Susan Powell, a 28-year-old mother of two, disappeared without a trace from her home in West Valley City, Utah. What seemed like a normal evening for a young family quickly turned into a nightmare that would span over a decade. Despite numerous investigations, Susan's case remains unsolved to this day. What happened to Susan Powell? Today, we uncover the tragic and disturbing story behind her disappearance. Susan Powell, a bright and loving woman, was married to Josh Powell, a man who, by all appearances, seemed like an ordinary husband and father. Together, they had two young boys, Charles and Braden. Susan worked as an assistant for a mortgage company, and on the surface, their family life appeared to be typical. However, beneath the surface, there were signs of trouble, and it was those troubling signs that would ultimately play a role in her disappearance. On the evening of December 6, Susan and Josh had planned a quiet night at home with their two children. But later that night, Josh told police he took their children on a late-night trip to the Utah desert, leaving Susan behind. Josh claimed that when he returned, Susan was gone. The door was unlocked, and her purse, keys, and cell phone were left behind. It seemed as if she had vanished without a trace. Josh reported Susan missing around 5 a.m. on December 7, and the police quickly responded. Authorities were immediately suspicious about the story Josh had told, and the timeline seemed inconsistent. For one, Josh claimed he had taken the children out to the desert at around 12:30 a.m., leaving Susan at home. But the more they questioned him, the more details didn't add up. In his interviews with investigators, Josh's story kept changing. He claimed that Susan was asleep when he left with the children and that she had willingly stayed behind. But his strange behavior and inconsistent statements raised more questions than answers. No one could understand why Susan would just vanish, leaving behind her children and personal belongings. The investigation quickly began to focus on Josh Powell as the primary suspect. Investigators started to focus on the areas Josh had mentioned, including the remote desert where he claimed to have gone that night. But there was no sign of Susan anywhere in the area. Despite multiple searches, there was no physical evidence to suggest that Susan had been in the desert or had left the house on her own. What was even more troubling was that Josh's story kept shifting, and he refused to cooperate fully with the investigation. Susan's family was in disbelief. Her parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, had always been wary of Josh. They had noticed signs of controlling behavior and emotional manipulation in their daughter's marriage. They feared for Susan's safety, and as the investigation progressed, their suspicions only grew stronger. They also learned that Susan had confided in them about her troubled marriage and fears for her safety, which only intensified their concerns. Susan's family, along with investigators, began to uncover troubling details about Josh Powell's past. It was revealed that Josh had a history of volatile behavior, and his father, Stephen Powell, had also been implicated in a disturbing case of criminal activity. However, despite these revelations, the police had no concrete evidence linking Josh to Susan's disappearance. In the following months, the investigation expanded to include Josh's father, Stephen Powell. Stephen had made disturbing remarks about Susan and had been secretly recording videos of her without her knowledge. This led to a search of Stephen Powell's home, where police discovered disturbing evidence, including thousands of videotapes and photos of Susan. While Stephen Powell was arrested for voyeurism and other crimes, the question remained, what happened to Susan? In the years that followed, Josh Powell's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was later arrested for the abuse of his children, and in 2012, after losing custody of his sons, Josh made a tragic and horrific decision. On February 5, 2012, while visiting his sons in a supervised home visit, Josh locked the door, set the house on fire, and killed himself and his two children. The devastating event sent shockwaves through the investigation, but it also further solidified the suspicion that Josh Powell was responsible for Susan's disappearance. There is no conclusive evidence to explain what happened to her that night in 2009. However, the tragedy of Susan's case has sparked important conversations about domestic violence, control, and manipulation in relationships. Her family has continued to fight for justice and to keep Susan's memory alive. Susan Powell was a loving mother, a daughter, and a sister, and her disappearance has left an indelible mark on those who loved her. Susan's family deserves answers, and the mystery surrounding her disappearance still lingers.